The death penalty is when someone commits a really vile crime, so much so that the state, the country that that person lives in, believes that the person, in order to be punished, in order to have retribution, in order to have a deterrent, and in order to have a good criminal justice system, believes that that person needs to die, and therefore they will commit something called the death penalty. Now, in history, if we look at the death penalty as a historical thing, in the UK, in the United Kingdom, it was abolished in 1965 because it was believed to be just something that was inhumane. You can't punish a criminal by killing them because they don't learn anything from their mistakes. There's no reformation. In 1969, that was permanent, and there hasn't been any more death penalties given out in the UK since then. In the world, we were quite a forerunner in the abolition of the death penalty, because in 1977 only 9 nations had banned the death penalty, only 9 in the whole world. Now there's over 140 nations that have banned the death penalty. That's over 2/3 of the world's countries that actually do not have the death penalty anymore. However, the death penalty is actually on the rise recently. In 2013, very recently, the death penalty is shown to be going up. There's more and more countries that give the death penalty. And here are the top 5 countries. You see a picture of the top 5 countries that are giving out the death penalty at the moment. Of course, the USA and China are 2 countries that we know particularly well. And the key thing is that China itself actually gives out more death sentences than all of the other countries put together. So China is actually probably the biggest killer of its own people by use of the death penalty than any other country in the world. Now, we're going to look at our arguments for the death penalty first of all. And the key thing is that, the first one is retribution, our key word for punishment. Terrorists and murderers deserve to die. We should have a life for a life, that people who kill other people should deserve to die. Now, the key one for the death penalty itself, as we've looked at before, is that it's a deterrent. The death penalty should deter other people from committing the same crime. So, for example, if a country has the death penalty, then that should put people off from killing each other or having horrible things. Protection. Now, the punishment in the UK for murder is a life sentence, and that's only really going to be a maximum of 25 years. So if you actually kill someone who's killed someone else, or you have the death penalty, then that's obviously going to protect other people. And finally, the last argument for the death penalty is one about finance. That keeping people in prison, as we've looked at, costs £45,000 a year. So if you actually terminate their lives of the worst offenders, then that's actually going to save the taxpayers money. Okay, arguments against the death penalty. Now, obviously, the biggest one here is that often people make mistakes, and countries have made mistakes. Since the death penalty is finished in the UK, 3 people have since been what's called posthumously pardoned, in that they've received a pardon despite the fact that they've been killed by the state. So innocent people have been executed. And in fact, the USA, as you saw there, they're the 5th biggest killers of people in the world. And what's happened since they've stopped since the 1970s, they've been doing the death penalty for much longer than that, but since the 1970s, 150 people on death row have ceased to be their crimes. They've been let off early. A deterrent. There's no evidence that it's actually a deterrent. In fact, in the state of New York, since the death penalty has actually been there, crime and murder has actually gone up, not down. So, it's no deterrent, it's no putting people off the crime. Penultimate one, reformation. Now, reformed criminals can be an enormous influence for good. If we look at people like G. Walker, I'm hoping that the killers of her son, are actually going to be people who can do good in the world and actually put people off committing crime. So reformed criminals can be an enormous influence for good. And finally, I suppose the religious reason is that only God can truthfully judge somebody and end a person's life. So is it God who gives life, and therefore only God can take it away? And that leads us on to what do religious believers believe about the death penalty. Now, Muslims, as you could see before, that 3 of the 5 countries, the top 5 countries that have the death penalty, are Islamic. They're Muslim countries. And that's because Muslims do believe that the death penalty is a good thing. They believe it's actually a deterrent and should deter people from committing the crime. So actually, Muslim countries, Muslims believe that. And here you can see a quote from the Quran about, retribution. We have granted the right of retribution to the heir, and that's something we've looked at before, and we've looked at that. And so many Muslims actually do believe in the death penalty. And for Christians, now whilst some Christians believe in the idea of an eye for an eye, the idea comes from the Bible, the eye for an eye, Christians actually believe that the death penalty is wrong. And the major reason why they believe in that is because Jesus himself was an innocent victim of capital punishment. He was crucified on the cross, and despite the fact that he was innocent, he was still made to go through the horrific penalty or judgment of death. Now also the other thing is, as we know from our looking at G. Walker and her forgiveness of the people who killed her son, the idea of forgiveness is important in Christianity. And the idea of Jesus on the cross, he actually says, Father, forgive, for they know not what they do. Now, you obviously can't forgive someone if they've died. If they're dead, the forgiveness is not an option. Reformation is not an option. So for Christianity, it's actually really important that the idea of forgiveness is there. So they do not generally agree with the death penalty. However, some believe it's important because of the idea of an eye for an eye. And finally, we give this, we're going to look at this idea of an eye for an eye in a bit more detail. Now this man here, his name's Mahatma Gandhi, he famously said that an eye for an eye makes a whole world blind. Basically what that means is this: if one person kills another, then are we making ourselves just as bad by killing them? A society, does it make itself just as bad for killing a criminal for killing someone else? If two wrongs don't make a right, and all that kind of idea. Mahatma Gandhi said an eye for an eye makes a whole world blind, because one person's mistake, does that go unpunished, or does someone else punish that and someone else punish that? And it reminds me of a story of a 10-year-old girl. And a 10-year-old girl is stood outside a Los Angeles jail. And what is happening is her dad has been convicted of a crime, and he is going to receive the death penalty on that night. And as he's receiving the death penalty, the girl has been told all the way through her life that the dad is going to receive the death penalty because he killed somebody. Because he killed somebody, then he is going to have to die. And so the little girl quite logically says, after her dad has been killed by the state, she says, "Okay, who's going to die because of my dad being killed?" So basically what she's saying is that my dad killed someone, therefore he's going to be killed. So now he's been killed, who's going to die for her dad? And I want to leave you with that one, really. Is the death penalty a good thing that protects the state and acts as a deterrent? Or is the death penalty actually, does it work? Is it inhumane? Does it go against society and how we treat people? So, ladies and gentlemen, is the death penalty a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think?